As far back as I can remember, I always wanted to be a gangster.
There's been some debate over the years about what the greatest gangster movie of all time is. It really comes down to two films in particular, The Godfather and Goodfellas. Both are masterpieces of filmmaking, both are probably in my top 10 movies of all time. The difference between them is The Godfather is a more operatic portrayal of the mob. Things are much more romanticized, and I don't mean that in a negative necessarily. But for comparison's sake, Goodfellas to me took the opposite approach. Martin Scorsese is often quoted many times as saying the book felt like a documentary to him, and that's one of the things that appealed to him about adapting it. He knew he could give you a very honest look at the mob, possibly from a perspective that we've never seen before on film at that time. It's not a glamorous lifestyle, and he doesn't portray it that way. He shows you characters that aren't necessarily good people, characters that make it hard for the viewer to root for. Of course you find them interesting, and you should, because they're well written, but you're simultaneously repulsed by them. He showed the real consequences. He showed the rise and fall of someone who chooses to live this life. He was able to find this weird balance where he portrays the events of the film as a tragedy, but at the same time, you really get the sense that these people are getting what they deserve. That kind of moral dilemma is not easy to pull off, and not every director can do that. To me, Goodfellas is just a completely immersive experience. I remember watching it for the first time, and this wasn't a movie that I grew up on necessarily. I probably watched it in my early teen years for the first time. I knew everyone involved in the movie, and I knew I liked all those people, so that drew me to it. But I knew Joe Pesci as Harry from Home Alone or Leo from Lethal Weapon, like I hadn't seen him in this type of role up until that point. And I honestly had no idea what I was in for. If you don't give it a chance, you'll just go into it thinking you're going to be watching a standard gangster flick, and that's just not the case. Truth is, it had me hooked from the very first view, and I was sucked in immediately by this world. All because it felt so real to me. Like, this is the closest we're going to get to actually being in the mob. Some people with short attention spans would complain about the length. To me, the length of this movie is irrelevant because it doesn't feel like the runtime at all. The story is told in a way that's so fluent and so perfect that the time just flies by every time I watch it. The film has so many iconic scenes that if I see that scene being played on TV, I'll typically stop and watch it, and that usually leads to me watching the whole movie. It's just that kind of experience. Like, it's one of those movies that you just can't turn off. Martin Scorsese, to me, is top 5 all time as far as creative influences on me. The man just knows how to tell complex stories in the most rewatchable and digestible way possible. To me, he has no equal when it comes to crime movies. Like, that is his bread and butter. He has perfected it, and you'd be hard pressed to find anyone who does it better. Granted, there's this false perception out there that that's all he does, and that's not true either. He does other genres of movies for sure, but he's so good at this genre that that's what he's become known for. Basically, what I'm saying is that if you have no eye for filmmaking, you're going to say that all Scorsese does is make mob movies. Between Goodfellas, Casino, The Irishman, The Departed, all in this genre, but no two of those movies are the same to me. He elevates the genre each time and brings something unique to it. Every time he steps into this realm, he makes the subject matter relevant again. He has that power as a filmmaker. And to me, Goodfellas is the pinnacle of that. Goodfellas is Martin Scorsese's best movie, in my opinion, because it's a unique piece of storytelling. It's a whole new perspective on a story that you think you know. Goodfellas is an absolute masterpiece, and you'd be hard-pressed to find a film that's more well-made than this one. Just so everyone understands how important this movie is to me, I do have a gangster movie bar in my basement, as you can see. And right here, we have a carving in the top of my bar of Jimmy Conway from Goodfellas. Goodfellas was released in the US on September 19th, 1990. The film is directed by Martin Scorsese. It's an adaptation of the 1985 nonfiction book Wise Guy by Nicholas Pileggi. Pileggi also helped co-write the screenplay along with Scorsese. The film stars Robert De Niro as Jimmy Conway, Ray Liotta as Henry Hill, Joe Pesci as Tommy DeVito, Lorraine Bracco as Karen Hill, and Paul Sorvino as Paulie Cicero. The film narrates the rise and fall of mob associate Henry Hill and his friends and family from 1955 to 1980. The film was originally intended to be called Wise Guys to reflect the title of the book, but was later changed to Goodfellas by Scorsese and Pileggi, mainly because two other projects were already under development with a similar name. To prepare for their roles, De Niro, Pesci, and Liotta often spoke with Pileggi, who shared leftover material from writing the book. The real-life Henry Hill also offered pointers to the actors. It's reported he offered everything from mannerisms to speech patterns, to De Niro specifically for his character of Jimmy Conway. According to Joe Pesci, improvisation and ad-libbing was common in rehearsals. Scorsese gave the actors a lot of freedom to do what they want. The director would often make transcripts of these rehearsal sessions, taking the lines he liked and putting them into the revised script. The film was shot on location in Queens, New York, New Jersey, and parts of Long Island during the spring and summer of 1989, on a budget of $25 million, Scorsese's most expensive film at the time. Scorsese has stated the film's style was inspired by the first 3 minutes of the 1962 film Jules and Jim. Extensive narration, quick edits, freeze frames, and multiple locale switches. In the first test screening, there were 40 walkouts in the first 10 minutes of the film. The film features no score, but does feature very specific songs hand-chosen by Scorsese to enhance each scene. Goodfellas would go on to make $46.8 million domestically at the box office. The film was widely praised by critics, often cited as the best film of the year in 1990 on many top 10 lists. It was nominated for 6 Academy Awards, but only one win, this coming for Joe Pesci in the Best Supporting Actor category. Best Picture that year was won by Dances with Wolves, and Best Director went to Kevin Costner for the same movie. To me, this was an absolute tragedy. Goodfellas was so critically acclaimed that year, it's hard to imagine why it didn't take home the biggest awards. It was much more deserving, I believe, and I think had a greater lasting impact on the landscape of cinema. Goodfellas is often cited as David Chase's biggest influence when making The Sopranos, another classic in the genre. Its impact cannot be denied.
One day some of the kids from the neighborhood carried my mother's groceries all the way home. You know why? It was out of respect.
At the start of this film, you see the mob through Henry's eyes as a young man. At first, like all of us, he's infatuated with it. Throughout the course of the film, though, you get to see how misguided Henry's infatuation with that life actually was. They show that in the very first scene where we see people who have very little regard for human life. They're riding around with a half-dead person in their trunk. They're going to dinner, they're telling jokes. They're very nonchalant about it. What they did to this guy is normal to them. It's second nature. It's just another day. But when Henry closes that trunk, you can see in his eyes that things have changed. They may not realize it, but he realizes in that moment that they've gone too far. This is going to be a major problem for them. To put that scene before the origin story was a brilliant move. It's in that moment where everything changes for Henry. It's not all fun and games anymore. It's not glamorous anymore. It's become something that he didn't sign up for. The use of a voiceover has become a bit of a calling card for Scorsese. I think it's most effective in this story because it just makes it feel that much more real. It makes it feel, like Scorsese said, almost documentary style. Henry's voiceover gives the audience insight and exposition in the most natural way possible. We now know exactly how these people think, and that enhances our viewing experience because we can look at the movie from a different perspective now. Henry is shown early on as having compassion, and that's kind of perceived as being a weakness. It's kind of used as a precursor to him turning informant later in the film. I have to say, Robert De Niro is the most Italian-looking guy of all time, but for some reason they always cast him as an Irishman. De Niro's Jimmy Conway acts as a de facto mentor to Henry and Tommy. And then you have a contradiction to Jimmy and Paulie, who is more of the strong, silent type. He's more methodical in the way he does things. And he's a very commanding presence because of it. I always felt like Henry should have listened to Paulie more rather than Jimmy. I just think if he stuck closer to Paulie, things probably would have turned out differently for him, for sure.
Look at me. Never rat on your friends, and always keep your mouth shut.
Martin Scorsese uses music in his films like no one else. The song selections he made for this movie just bring each and every scene to life. Honestly, I can't hear Layla now without thinking about bodies turning up all over the city. He took an already great song and gave it a new meaning with his visuals. And to me, he's just amazing for that. Probably the most famous scene in the movie was created through improv and inspired by a real-life incident that Joe Pesci experienced.
I'm funny how? I mean, funny like I'm a clown, I amuse you? I make you laugh? I'm here to fucking amuse you? What do you mean funny? Funny how? How am I funny?
Joe Pesci steals this movie, and a big reason for that is this scene. Think about how his emotions change throughout the course of that scene. He goes from kind of happy-go-lucky, telling jokes, then all of a sudden he switches to scary in a very short amount of time, and it's just so believable. You 100% believe he is on the verge of killing Henry in that scene. And then he manages to switch back by the end of it. It's a brilliant piece of acting, and we learn everything we need to know about Tommy's character in that scene. I want you to think about this for a second. Joe Pesci won an Oscar for this role, and deservedly so, but he won it playing a character with virtually no character development. Tommy is who he is the whole time he's on screen. But Joe Pesci is so good at what he does and so convincing that it's easily ranked as one of the best performances of all time. The character of Karen was always a strange one to me. Something always felt off about how she was portrayed in this film to me. That may have been a creative choice and done on purpose, but I'm just not entirely invested in her relationship with Henry. I don't really see what she likes about him so much. Power and money are the obvious answers, and that's what that whole famous tracking shot through the club is supposed to signify. She's becoming infatuated with that life much like he did. But going back to their relationship, from the first moment that they encounter each other, he's just horrible to her. And then there's the scene where he beats the neighbor half to death in the driveway. Probably one of the most violent scenes in movie history, by the way. And look, did the guy deserve it? Absolutely. But something to that level might be a red flag to a normal thinking woman. And I know she does mention that when he hands her the gun that he pistol whipped the guy with. But I don't know, that relationship just always felt a little bit weird to me. I will say this too, the pistol whip scene does create another moral dilemma. Because as I said, the guy does deserve it, but it's also very uncomfortable to watch.
You want fucko? You want some? Huh?
Oh! Hey! What are you doing?
Throughout the course of this movie, Henry is being programmed to not be concerned with consequences. Nobody goes to jail unless they want to. Then when the Billy Bat situation happens, that's when everything changes for him. It's an amazing scene, by the way, and quotable for days.
Now go home and get your fucking shine box.
Motherfucking
But suddenly now, Henry is paranoid. This is the beginning of his downfall. Tommy's temper and Jimmy's enabling has created a dangerous situation for them. Then later, when they actually have to move the body, it's more jokes from Tommy and Jimmy, like nothing phases these two guys. I always thought it was cool too how Scorsese bathes the scene in this red light. It just makes him look that much more evil.
Here's a leg. Here's a wing. What do you like, the leg or the wing, Henry? Oh, you still go for your hearts and lungs.
Henry's disappointment continues, I think, with the whole spider sequence. Tommy, of course, is messing around, being reckless, and shoots Spider in the foot. The next time they see each other, Spider decides to stand up to Tommy. Of course, Tommy, being the psychopath that he is, he can't deal with someone standing up to him or talking back to him, and he just kills Spider indiscriminately.
You gonna let this fucking punk get away with that? What's the matter? What's the world coming to?
Again, showing no remorse and even tries to justify it. That's just how twisted his thought process is. Then we come to the prison scene, which I'm sure is greatly exaggerated. It's just another fascinating look into this life because even when they go to jail, they're not going to jail. Like, jail for them is not the same as it is for everyone else. It's almost like a vacation. Again, no consequences. This is, however, where Henry starts to dabble in the drug business. Henry lets his greed get the better of him, and he lies to Paulie when Paulie is trying to tell him to not mess around with drugs. To make things worse, he brings in Tommy and Jimmy as partners, which is never a good idea. It's just bad decision after bad decision from Henry. Then we have the Latanza heist, which should have been their greatest triumph, but it actually ends up ripping the whole crew apart because Jimmy becomes paranoid and starts to kill everyone who was connected with it. Granted, some people in the crew were making very bad decisions with the money they made.
What's the matter with you?
Next, we have Tommy getting told that he's going to be made. Again, this should be a triumph for them. This is going to make them more powerful. They'll now have someone connected to them on the inside. But Tommy's past transgressions with Billy Bats finally come back to haunt him. Tommy is killed because he broke the rules and killed a made man.
Oh, no.
If you don't have rules, there's no structure and things turn to chaos. What's also interesting is that at this point, this is where Scorsese switches the whole style of the movie. Things aren't as organized anymore for Henry, and the shots in the film reflect that. It's stuff like this that makes Scorsese next level in my personal opinion. There's lots of fast cuts and shots of Henry being strung out. The movie itself is reflecting Henry's now chaotic life. And his lack of organization because of his addiction to drugs is what ultimately gets him arrested. This inspires two very telling reactions. Paulie simply turns his back on him, and Jimmy decides that he wants him dead. If that doesn't sum up those two characters, I don't know what does. I have to quickly talk about the scene where Karen visits Jimmy. Honestly, this scene could have been cut out, but I'm glad it wasn't because it's actually one of my favorite scenes in the movie. It's an amazing scene because there's just so much tension. As the viewer, you feel like she's in danger, but it could also just be her paranoia manifesting itself on screen. It's just such a well-crafted scene. Either way, Henry sees no other option than to rat on his friends. Acting is done with people's eyes and faces. The looks on Paulie and Jimmy's faces in that courtroom when Henry rats them out, they say so much. It's just pure disdain for Henry at that point. So Henry, of course, has to go into witness protection. The last thing we see in the movie is him leading a regular life. What's interesting is the voiceover says that he's miserable, but the character kind of smirks at the screen. It creates an interesting contradiction. Like, how does Henry really feel about what he did? I always took it as he misses aspects of the life, but he's also very lucky to be alive. And it may not be a glamorous life that he's leading now, but it is certainly less stressful. But I'm sure all that is open to interpretation. That's the beauty of this film. You can watch it 100 times, which I have, and take it 100 different ways. That's because Scorsese's attention to detail in this film is just next level. And I truly believe he created something with Goodfellas that can never be replicated. It's a unique cinematic experience, and it should be experienced by anyone who values great filmmaking. It's a 10 out of 10 for me, a highly recommended masterpiece. Please go check it out if you haven't already.
Everybody had their hands out. Everything was for the taking. And now it's all over.